Here is the second lecture, mini lecture, I guess, that I'll be giving to help assist in your response to your Moodle questions for this week. I should note that I'm not giving a full outline of all of the stuff that you need to engage in order to answer those questions. So you need to rely heavily on your reading from Steinmetz, Williams, Pelican, and also from McGrath, your textbook, for the answers to these questions. However, I think with this lecture and the one on Europe and politics, it helps kind of fill out some of the other factors that need to be talked about with Europe and the Reformation. So we're going to dive right in. One of the main things I didn't get a chance to talk about last semester was the rise and fall of the papacy. And that's very important when we get to this stage of the game of the Reformation, especially late medieval church, early Reformation. The papacy is very important. So the things that we need to consider when talking about the rise and fall of the papacy is, what is the role of the papacy after the fall of the Roman Empire? Remember, Rome and its religious functions stay generally intact even though the emperor's deposed. Now, a lot of that is because, remember, Constantine moves the capital to Constantinople. That's in a whole different quadrant of the Mediterranean, and so the Roman Empire still is maintained through that. But when the fall of the Roman Empire, generally speaking, happens, the Bishop of Rome is still in place in the Holy City. So we have a lot of stuff to talk about with the rise and fall of the papacy and what happens to the papacy after Rome falls. Second, and I think this is important, the height of papal authority comes in Pope Innocent III, who is the Pope during the time of Francis of Assisi. You may remember I mentioned him when we were talking about St. Francis. He's the one that grants St. Francis the right to start a new religious order. And this is a part of Pope Innocent's plan to reform the church and kick out and basically end all of the heretical spiritual orders that are out there. And so the Franciscans are founded by St. Francis for that purpose on his end, but supported by Pope Innocent because this is an end that he's hoping to achieve. Third, and this is when things start to fall apart for the papacy, is the Council of Constance. Now, the Council of Constance is important because there's a political problem that happens in the church when there's a pope. Pope Gregory dies, and in his place is elected another pope that goes against a lot of the French cardinals, and so they kind of defect and elect their own pope. But when we get there, we'll get a little bit more into that. The important thing, though, is not about who gets elected and after which pope. The important thing is what happens as a result of the Council of Constance. All three popes that are elected, they're called the anti-popes, are deposed by this council, and Pope Martin V is elected in their place. And there is a standard by which the council says that now the pope must sit under another authority, namely the rules of God. But this questioning or this disturbance of the papal authority really strikes a blow to how important and how authoritative the papal office is going to be. You'll see after this, the papal office has a hard time influencing or maintaining its excommunications. Remember, that's one of the biggest problems that the church, or the biggest weapons that the church has at this time, is to excommunicate people. And we shouldn't look at that term necessarily as always a negative thing. I mean, sometimes Pope Innocent excommunicated people who are doing really egregious things in order to get them to stop, and that worked as well as any military advantage that an army could do. Because what they were doing was egregious. We're not going to talk about that a whole lot, but that's an example where excommunication achieves a good purpose. But after this council, this kind of activity by the Pope is something that is less and less possible of happening because of that now the Pope can be questioned and the Pope is fallible. So anyway, next, as a result, direct result of Council of Constance, there is a significant political pushback. Now there is a sense in which if the Pope must submit to another authority. And remember, as I talked about in the politics of Europe, there's a deeply entrenched Augustinian notion about the existence of another order. Why not have the Pope submit to that one? If the political orders are really there to maintain the peace, why not even maintain the peace within the church? So, not since Constantine do we have a political figure coming in, interceding in order to keep the peace in the church. This is something that hasn't happened in a while. However, despite all of this, the church still has authority. The church still has power. Remember, we still haven't gotten to the point where the church is not the binding, unifying factor between all these various cultures. We still have much of the influence, and the reason that is because of Latin. Now, that may seem dumb, but when we get there, you'll see that, by this point in the world, Latin was primarily used as a common dialect, in the early 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, and even before that, in the before the Common Era. And now that the world has kind of expanded, the language has kind of devolved into, instead of Latin, we're speaking unique forms of Latin. And what that means for the church and its continued providence, we'll get to it when we get there. But all of these things are very important to what will happen right before Martin Luther starts his Reformation project. Now, the Christians are not responsible in many ways for all that has happened in Europe in terms of its secularity and all of that stuff, but it is certainly a part of this whole project that is coming to a head right here in the 15th century when we get there, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So, the history of the rise of the papacy is really, really interesting. The Pope is considered the Bishop of Rome, and the reason why that authority is given to, the Bishop of Rome as opposed to, say, the Bishop of Jerusalem, whom you might think has more of a authority because that's the place where Christ lived. But the papal authority, through exegesis, on this rock I will build my church. That is what Jesus says to Peter. Petros actually means rock, which is Greek for Peter. Peter was martyred in Rome. So that is why the bishopry of Peter, or the authority of Peter, falls on the see of Rome. And so when Constantine leaves Rome to go to Constantinople, there is a power vacuum that is left in his wake. Normally the emperor and the Bishop of Rome would confer and share power, but once Constantine leaves, someone needs to step into that power vacuum. And remember, we talked about Gregory the Great. This is still all under the history of the rise of papacy, by the way. We talked about Gregory the Great. He was the first person called Pope. He negotiated the peace of the Lombards, you may remember that, converted them to Christianity. He was a very, very important pope. During this period, obviously, when that power vacuum was laid upon the Bishop of Rome. Another really important pope is 751 Pope Zacharias. He had another problem with the Lombards and deposes a king to deal with them, or makes a king in order to deal with them, Pippin. And then in 800, that's when Charlemagne comes onto the scene, and that's when Pope Leo III plants a crown on his head. And so he does and oversees this time in Rome. Remember, Charlemagne never moves to Rome to set up his rule, but rather stays where the Franks live as the king of the Franks. That's where the center of his kingdom is. And so the Pope stays in Rome as the head of this political order in Rome. He's got a lot of authority. And he's actually responsible for the first era in history when there were forced conversions. This is something Constantine never did, by the way. So anyway, now the Eastern Christians were seeing this. This is, again, all backdrop to this. There were people who were buying ecclesial offices. Remember the addition of the filioque, which is just basically Greek for "and the Son." I remember they added that to the creed. The Spirit proceeds from the Father, and then the Western churches added, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father, and then the Western churches added, and from the Son. If you see the Eastern version of the Nicene Creed, you'll see that that is not in there. So that was something that was added. Now, at this point, we still don't have a doctrine of papal infallibility. But in 1054 CE, the Easterns are no longer buying the West as the center of the church. This is probably right on the edge of when the schism is about to happen. At this point, Pope Gregory VII, the Bishop of Rome, he's the Bishop of Rome from 1073 to 1085, he declares that only the Bishop of Rome can be called Pope. Gregory was also responsible for challenging the practice of kings getting paid by their prospective bishops. So people that wanted to be bishops paid the king in order to get some political advantage in their election. Now, the papacy removes itself from imperial authority of Rome in the 7th century. This is over an issue of taxation. So if the papacy was directly appointed over the church, then this is becoming, remember we talked about with Augustine, this is giving credence to the fact that the church is now in the 7th century, so this is like 200 years at most, 200 years at least after Augustine writes the City of God. The church is coming to be seen as the city of God on earth. And so there's an equation that had never happened. Remember, the importance of the city of God for Augustine was that no order on earth can claim to be the tangible manifestation of the city of God. They just can't. Because the city of God is something that is completely eternal, and something that forms and influences us from the eternal realm. So it can't be a place here that is embedded within material orders and seeks material ends as their own. And so this type of perspective basically is starting to become ahead in the medieval churches. We're heading into the medieval church. And furthermore, remember that power vacuum. You know, the political orders that are happening at this point heading into the medieval church are very fluid. There's not one emperor over everyone else. Charlemagne's probably the closest and last one that could probably fill that role. But who's the thing that remains? The Pope. The Pope remains. And so the Pope is given the authority to crown kings. Remember, he crowned Charlemagne. And it's seen that not only that kings and political orders happen within the world, but that those things are only seen as a last resort. The main way that the world is meant to be governed is by priests, by religious leaders. And this is an analogy in the exegesis of those who are what we call papal apologists. That they apply the papal office to what Moses did. So when Moses takes over and protects the Israelites, he doesn't elect political leaders. He rather elects priests to help them govern, to help guide them, not kings. And so this is seen in the present time to these people as what the Pope is doing. And so the authority that is bestowed on the king is of the last resort. So the fact that Pope Leo cannot negotiate with the Lombards in order to protect Rome, he has to place a crown on Charlemagne's head in order to make him emperor to protect Rome. So these are all part of what's going into the milieu that is the papal authority at this time. And so the important thing you need to remember is that as the papacy rises, the church is becoming equated with the city of God. All right. So The next thing that you need to see is Pope Innocent. Remember, I talked about how he was the most powerful, most influential pope of this whole era. That is really the prominence and dominance really of the papal authority in Europe. So Pope Innocent is Pope from 1198 to 1216. Many believe or consider him to be the most influential Pope of his time. He confronted both kings of England and France. Remember, remember I mentioned at the outset that Pope Innocent excommunicated some individuals. There's actually a war going on between England and France that he intercedes for, excommunicating one side in order to seek a peaceful resolution, and it works. Now, he uses the Crusades and the Inquisitions as political ends in order to bring unity to what's left of the Holy Roman Empire, and that succeeds. He's able to use that as a political propaganda. So this is something that's a common theme throughout time with politics. For example, when you look at Hitler in World War II, he's able to rally the German people around him because he's able to give them a common enemy, namely the Jews. And so if he's able to give them a common enemy, they will all work together towards defeating that end. And so, same with Pope Innocent. If we can reclaim the Holy Lands, then we can all be working towards one common end. So, very important. Like I said before, he gives Francis of Assisi permission to start his order. And he's basically very involved in the political orders and realities of his day. Very involved, unlike any other pope. And then after him is when the decline starts to happen. So he has this sun-moon analogy. So the pope was the sun, and the kings are the moon. The pope is the greater light, and the kings are the lesser light. So the pope, if you can see this through this imagery, is seen at this time as the one who actually governs this area of the world, the one who's actually in charge. And so he's the supreme ruler. You might remember that pyramid that I showed you of feudalism. There's the pope that is at the top of the political order, even though he's at the top of the cathedral. And that's all about the fact that that vacuum that was left by the Roman Empire after Constantine was assumed by the Pope, and it grew and it grew and it grew all the way until Pope Innocent's time. So anyway, that sun and moon analogy gives a really good picture of how people saw papal authority in his time. However, in addition, and this is someone you're going to hear me quote a lot, Stephen Osment, the popes created a lot of problems for future popes during this period. And this is a quote from Osment. Many of the papacy's problems in the late Middle Ages stemmed directly from the pope's continuing conception of himself as more politically powerful than he could be in the new world of ascendant secular nation states. So the pope is now coming up against these rising political nation states. Remember I talked about in the Politics in Europe lecture that there are these cultures that are growing up right around what's happening around the Holy Roman Empire. And as these cultures are growing up, they're wanting to govern themselves, and they're wanting the religious authority to be more localized than just having a one person who's in charge of all of them. And so this is going to come into direct confrontation with the Pope. And as his power diminishes, these secular authorities are going to rise to the occasion to replace that power vacuum. So the unity of Europe is coming to an end quickly, and the Reformation probably, in a lot of ways, is the final nail in the coffin of what that is going to be. And so Pope Innocent helps us kind of see what's at stake here. So I talked about this at the beginning. There's the Council of Constance, and some of the particulars aren't really necessary at this point in time. If you want to read up on it, there are lots of ways to do that. I would check out, if you're wanting to know more, Stephen Osment's book, The Age of Reform. That's a really important book, not just on the Council of Constance, but on the age leading up to the Reformation altogether. So there was a Western schism that happened after Pope Gregory died. And after Pope Gregory died, um, Gregory the 11th, there were 3 popes that ended up getting elected because the cardinals were so divided. And so this council was called in 1414 in order to deal with this problem. And it deposed all of the anti-popes. They made them, basically all 3 of them resign because it was not going to be good for the entire church if if one of the 3 was allowed to remain. And instead, they elected Pope Martin V. Now, the most interesting part about this is not just the fact that it deposed these 3 popes, but this statement here. Legitimately assembled in the Holy Spirit, constituting a general council and representing the Catholic Church militant, it has power immediately from Christ, and that everyone of whatever state or dignity, even papal, is bound to obey it in those matters which pertain to the faith, the eradication of the said schism, and the general reform of the said Church of God in the head and members. So this council was asserting authority over the Pope. And that hadn't been the case. There hadn't been a council that had done that since the beginning of the church, really. And so it's a benchmark because it places the Pope under the authority of the church in a very particular way. And implicit in this is the very fact that it is challenging the authority of the Pope. Now, it's a right challenge. It's not a bad challenge. I think it's an appropriate challenge. But the authorities that have been waiting for some type of thing like this are going to come in at this point. It's also worth noting that the Catholic Church does not recognize this as authoritative. But nonetheless, this is something that happened during the rise of the medieval church and leading into the period of reform. Remember, the Reformation is right around the corner from this. And so next, we're talking about the political pushback. Like I said, Constance had a fallout with the way that the establishment had a fallout which led to the establishment of redundancy that helped keep popes in line. So one of the main things that had to happen after this council was that they were looking for a way to keep this thing from happening again, to keep the church from schisming again. Because remember, it has to be one holy Catholic Church. One, it's important because it's because of its unity. Remember, this is also something that is in the arguments that are in the Donatist controversy that Augustine's dealing with, and so this is something that never really goes away. And so during this kind of period of uncertainty, and then this placing the Pope under this type of magisterial authority by a council. There were other councils that were called in order to describe and set up policies that basically said, to what degree is the Pope subject and liable to these councils? To what degree do we have the authority to hold them accountable? And so in its stead, again, another vacuum is created, and a secular authority and secular authorities in their own area come to the fore. Now, the papal authority does not go away. It does not cease to be. It's not like when Constantine leaves Rome, there's a actual visible vacuum that is taken up by the Pope, by the Bishop of Rome. But here, we just have, there's now room for these things to step into the foreground. And now the papal authority is not as able as it once was to enforce its policies anymore in Europe. It was not able to be as influential as it once was. Okay, so now the important thing here is that there's this whole fragile existence that now is available in the church. Like I said, in the politics in Europe section, we have famine, black plague, overpopulation, disparity of wealth. All of these things led a lot of people to lose faith in the church because a lot of people saw it as God's punishment. Furthermore, it's not like all of these popes were good people. I mean, Pope Innocent, as good as some of the things that he did do, was still responsible in part for one of the Crusades, of which there are many. The popes are starting to be seen as immoral people. Remember, I mentioned in 1054, the Eastern Church is starting to question whether or not the Western Church is a moral place, whether what they're doing is right. And so this fragile existence is now created for the church because of all these things, and a lot of them they've really done to themselves. Um, that now non-ecclesial authorities of the 14th and 15th century are going to rise and challenge the papal authority in Europe for control. Now, you're asking, after all of these things, how does the church maintain any authority whatsoever? Now, and this is going to sound bad, but I need you to bear with me through this. It's because of Latin. It's in part because of a lot of things, but in a lot of ways it's because of Latin. Most of the church's writing was in Latin. The Bible was in Latin. It was not in the language of the people. So remember, I talked about at the outset that it has been many, many centuries since Latin has been the common language of the people. Most of the areas in Europe that we're now dealing with have some form or some primitive dialect that is replacing Latin as the language of the common people. So, for example, in the Frankish area, it's French. In the English area, it's English. Germanic, German, Spanish, Spain, all of these areas are speaking forms of Street Latin. That's why if you've ever taken Latin, you probably are well equipped to learn a whole host of European languages because they all derive from Latin. So what do you do if the common person on the street can't speak the language in which the Holy Scriptures are written in? You give it to them through pastors and priests, through monks, through all these types of things that the church sponsors and sanctions. And so the church held the communities together because there is one source, the Catholic Church, that was able to dispense this knowledge to the people. Now, there are some pros and there are some cons of that. The pros are that people will use the Bible to their own ends. And so, in some senses, by not translating the Bible into the language of the common people, you are preventing people from doing things in the name of a text that they don't completely understand. Only the educated pastors, only the ones who are trained in theology, trained in the scriptures, trained in the tradition, are able to cultivate and interpret the Bible for people so that they don't end up doing things that are ill-advised towards their neighbor because they don't have a whole perspective. So, for example, the person who drowns their child because they hear the voices in their head, which they think are God, telling them to do so, they make reference to Isaac and Abraham without a trained pastor or priest to tell them that is crazy, don't drown your kids. So that's the positive. The negative side is this leads to a massive abuse of power. So one of the things that Martin Luther will be warring against that you might already know popularly is the idea of indulgence. So to raise money in the church, the church would sell these indulgences, which would get people out of purgatory, or even get people into heaven. They were items that you could buy at your local church, and they were basically a piece of paper that said that the Pope will pray over these people, and basically pray them out of purgatory into heaven. So that's a thing that's happening. And the reason why people can't challenge this is because they don't really know what the Bible says. They only know what they're being told the Bible says. And so there's a massive abuse of power of this. And these are the struggles that we have here with translating the Bible into the language of common people. Now, again, I want you to see this for what it is. This is one of the means by which the church has the amount of authority that it still does within its own within the greater European area. It's not confined to the Italian peninsula. It is all of Europe, basically, under the authority of these individuals who are the church. And there's good and bad, and I hope that I've shown that at least to you. And so now, in review, the political power of the Pope was strong in the Middle Ages. Case in point, Pope Innocent. After the controversy addressed at the Council of Constance, papal authority began to diminish. It's just a historical. Is a historical. Basically, it's a historical observation. And lastly, the ecclesial authority still had sway due to its source of theological authority. It still governed the political. It still governed the spiritual lives of people, which were very important, at the very least. They still had influence in political matters, but you can see these two begin to pull apart. How the church was regulated to the spiritual lives, and that there's this larger political reality that was becoming unhinged from the church, and creating a new way of being in the world that's not tied to ecclesial orders, and that's good and bad. But the point is that this is what really held the church together for a really long time. And we have to be aware of this as we go into the Reformation. And so, as you're answering your question about why the church is reformed, I want you to consider everything that I've talked about here. Okay? All right. Well, thanks, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you soon.